Good morning, fam. My name is Jawan Hall, and I'm here to discuss the book No Longer Slave, Galatians, an African American Experience by Reverend Dr. Brad R. Braxton. My teammate, Dr. Janet Floyd, was supposed to join me today, but Dr. Floyd has had a lot of issues, a lot of family issues because of this coronavirus pandemic. She's actually had people to pass away, as well as people in ICU right now. So she and I agreed that I would do the podcast and she would send in her commentary about the book. And that's what she did. So we'll start with me actually giving my perspective about the book. And then I go into what Dr. Floyd sent in as far as her perspective and what she thought about the book. All right. Let's see. Well, the book is actually a pretty good book. I was actually kind of surprised that I would like the book because initially I wanted to change books. I wanted to read the book about gentrification because I was actually involved in that type of situation now, so I kind of had a little bit more knowledge about it. But I chose this book, and Dr. Floyd chose this book, and we were the only two people in the class compared to everybody, only two people in the group compared to everybody else's group that had about 5 or 6 people in it. But it was worth it. The book was pretty good. Some of the highlights about the book that I would like to discuss is basically, let's see, in chapter 1, when it talks about liberation in the African American experience. To me, this chapter was kind of the meat of the book because it actually showed you exactly what it was that Dr. Braxton was trying to get us to understand, and that is basically shifting the hermeneutical lens of reading the Bible and basically supplanting the African American experience in the Word as you're reading it. I think it's something imperative that we all learn to do, but I find it kind of ironic that we actually have to do that because when you think about the Bible, it really is about Black people. So why would we have to shift the lens and make it an African American experience when it's already that? But in reality, it's not so much as about the characters or what the book is about. The problem comes in, it's about the storyteller. When the storyteller is not African American, they tend to shift the narrative. They tend to change the meaning and the revelation behind the scripture. And I think that's what Dr. Braxton wanted us to understand, that the hermeneutical lens needed to shift to basically allow Black people to see themselves in the Word and understand what God is saying to us as well as what God is saying about us. What he's saying to us, I think, is important because that is the basis of our relationship with God, having that level of communication and understanding what it is that God wants from us, as well as what it is that God really requires of us, and vice versa, what it is that we want from God, and our ability to communicate that to him. I think that chapter 1 is for the liberation and the African American experience. The liberation, the Black liberation theology mindset is what he is pushing in the book. To understand that our minds need to be liberated from a white perspective of seeing things and doing things as well as reading things. And he wants us to really allow ourselves to experience God through an African American lens, but also kind of promoting that perspective to white America. Because when you really think about it, a lot of what Reverend Braxton is talking about is basically getting white people to understand that they don't own the narrative. And that's something that we are struggling to communicate to them, because for so long we've known that, but they've drowned our voice out with violence. They've drowned our voice out with bondage. They've drowned our voice out with oppression. So here we are in 2020, trying to get our voice back. And Reverend Bratson is Dr. Bratson is promoting that with us basically, what's the word I'm looking for here? With us basically communicating our ideology about Black liberation to a point to where they do not accept it as an all-out assault on what they have going on. Because one of the biggest issues that I realized about white America is they're afraid of us. They're afraid of the numbers. They're afraid that we have a motive, and they're afraid that we have revenge in our heart towards the things that they've done to us. And Dr. Bratson talks about that in the book. But the hermeneutical lens that he wants to promote as far as Black liberation theology, that's not a part of it. There's no revenge as far as that's concerned. It's all about communication. It's all about understanding. It's all about having a right to be on the same field as them, as well as have a voice, and not have them try to strip us of our Black African-American experience the way they did when we first got here. He also talks about sympathetic white people and what would be required of them as far as them becoming Black. And becoming Black meaning that Reverend Bratson, he basically alluded to the fact that in order for white people to really understand us and really be about us and really be for us, they have to become Black. And he referred to the story about Nicodemus in the Bible about this, and it's very good. I'll touch on that later. But them becoming Black meaning that they have to really be willing to sit in the African American experience with us and realize that, you know what, a lot of what they have as white people has been given to them off the backs of Black Americans, of African Americans rather. And they have to be willing to help change laws, help bring awareness to the situation, help us as African Americans get back the things that were stolen from us and stripped from us while coming over here. And since we've been here, one of the things that I reflected upon when I was reading the book is all the police brutality that we have encountered in the past couple of years. And this is when I understood about what he was saying about what white people have to do as far as becoming Black. White pastors, especially white mega church pastors who have large numbers of African Americans in their congregations, if they are not willing to participate in the African American experience with us by speaking out about things like police brutality and racism and discrimination from their pulpits, then they're not for us. And like he was saying, as far as what Paul did in Galatians, how he stated that, hey, the people that are coming to you and giving you this pseudo gospel, I curse them. And Dr. Bratson said, we must have that same mentality for those people who are not willing to sit in this African American experience, promote it, sympathize with it, and help us progress in it. We got to curse them. And he's like, not with profanity or anything like that, but in essence, stop supporting them. Stop going to their churches. Stop going to their restaurants. Stop going and supporting the things that they have going on when they're not undergirding and helping us get out of these situations, these traps that they set for us many, many generations ago. And so I just reflected upon that while I was reading the Bible, when I was reading the book, because the overarching theme of the book is basically to get black people to wise up and open their eyes to what's really happening as far as white America is concerned. That we have to stop trying to assimilate and realize and embrace our blackness and truly live in it and embrace it and enjoy it and uplift it. And we have a right to do it. And that's one of the messages I got from that. We have to understand we have a right to be black and be proud of it and be at peace with it. But a lot of times we find ourselves we don't really have the peace that comes with it because there's so much violence, there's so much hatred, there's so much racism that comes from everywhere towards us. However, this was a very important point in the book that I got. And it's in my notes. Let me see if I can find it right quick. Basically, Dr. Braxton, he talks about there is a level of responsibility that goes with being black that we have to embrace when it comes to our situation in society. And that responsibility is knowing that we haven't done all we're supposed to do as black people, and we have to own up to that. There's a part of us that many of us realize that it's difficult being black and knowing how white people feel about you. But it becomes even more difficult when you're carrying the burden of black people who don't want to give their best, who don't want to do their best, who don't want to be at their best. And that's hard. You know, Braxton states that one of the most difficult things to realize one of the most menacing things to realize about African American is when your biggest enemy a lot of times has the same black skin as you do. And that is difficult. When empire is black. When empire is black. He talks about Jerusalem, and he talks about the Roman Empire in the book. And understand Jerusalem represents white society and our desire to be affirmed by him. So Paul is doing his thing, preaching to the Gentiles, and Peter and James and the rest of the apostles, they're preaching to the Jews. And they represent Jerusalem because they are spending their time there. And Paul is all over doing his missionary work and preaching in Galatians and realizing that, hey, you know, I got something important here. And he had been doing it for 14 years, and he felt like he needed to go to Jerusalem to speak with the apostles. But he didn't go to get their permission. He went to let them know what he was doing and how important it was, the work he was doing. So when we are looking at ourselves as far as what we're doing and the importance of what we do, a lot of times we just have to embrace the fact that you may be your only cheerleader, you may be your only supporter, and people are going to have their opinions about you no matter what. And you cannot allow yourself to get sucked in and in constant need of affirmation from people, especially white people, who may not ever affirm what you got going on, to keep you going and moving forward and doing what you're supposed to do. Paul was a great example of a man who was like, man, you know what? I'm not really concerned about what y'all got going on, but I just want to let y'all know Gentiles will be saved because I'm preaching to them. And, you know, that was a big move. That was a big move of Paul, because Paul was not really, you know, he wasn't a Bible scholar. You know, he wasn't affirmed by the early church. Paul received everything he got from God himself. And Paul felt good about it. And I think that's something that Braxton is constantly highlighting in the book, that we may not ever get what we want from white people, but what we did get from God is enough. We got this black skin, we got this black experience, we got this black experience with God, and we have to embrace it and know that that is truly enough. And do what we're supposed to do, and build our families, and live our lives accordingly. And and it's okay. Now this is what's really interesting, is that for many years, for many years, I thought that it was important that as blacks and white that we get along, and there should be some level of unity here. But Braxton speaks kind of against that. He speaks from a perspective of there may not ever be unity, but we can coexist and respect each other. And I think that's something that we have to embrace as black people, that we got to learn to pull back from needing white people to validate what we have going on and be okay with what we have going on. And Braxton highlights that in the book. Like, you know what? That's like a ransom that they hold over our heads, the affirmation that, hey, you guys can never be what you need to be until we as white people say so. We have to take that from them. We can't continue to allow that to be how they deal with us. Let's see what else. It's so much in the book. The book is very layered. The middle part of the book, when he talks about critical theories and things like that, I really wasn't that interested in that part, to be honest with you. But I think the heavy part of the book is the beginning and the end. Going back to the beginning, when he talks about black liberation as well as womanist theology, he said that's really the reason for the book. But I started to reflect upon my time at ITC, and I get the whole black liberation theology perspective about this book, and it's very apparent. But the womanist theology part, I kind of struggle with, because to me, he's still including some level of white thought there. I was hoping that he would have said black woman theology, because you and I both know that a black woman's theology is different from a white woman's theology. And if you're going to promote black liberation theology as far as the overarching perspective and what you're trying to achieve as far as the book is concerned, you can't just lay it down and say and be just all inclusive with womanist theology. It has to be black womanist theology. I remember, in one of my professor's class, and we talked about this book, what I think it's called Black Woman's Jesus and White Woman's Christ. And we read some of that book, and it made me realize that's when I started to see the shifting of understanding as to what God means to a black woman and what God means to a white woman. And that's why I feel like that should be a greater determining factor of what he's talking about is womanist theology in the book, that it should be more geared towards black womanist theology. What else? I struggle with the shifting of the hermeneutical lens for one reason that kept popping in my mind. And this is something that's going to require further discussion with my professors. When we look at the Bible as black people, we have struggled for many years to see ourselves in it, because a lot of times we can only hear the voice of a white person telling the story, even though it may be a black pastor, a black preacher, what have you. But it's still, from the King James Version, all these different versions, it still has this white tone to it. So it's only through the Holy Spirit we've been able to gauge this thing correctly and finally start to see ourselves in it. And the amazing part about it, like I said earlier, we've always been there. The Bible is about black people. Now, In embracing that, we have to realize that when we look at the word and truly putting the African American hermeneutical lens on it, we see ourselves as victors, meaning getting the victory. We see ourselves as victims, meaning the ones that have been oppressed rather. But we also have to spend time as being villains, meaning the ones that have caused issue within our own communities, within our own families, within our own selves. We don't spend a lot of time on the villain side. And it's something that in reading this book, it made me realize that we have to spend time there, because as long as we only see empire as white people, we'll never embrace our whole experience with God as victors, victims, and as villains. Because we have to realize, as empire crucified our black Jesus, there was a black church of Sadducees and Pharisees and the whole Sanhedrin Council. Those were black folk. Remember Hebrews? We always talk about we the chosen ones and this and that. So we have to understand that a lot of times when we participate as being villains, we bring stuff on ourselves. And this whole experience of being black embodies all three. We can't just allow ourselves to just focus on, well, we're being oppressed by white people. We can't always just focus on, well, we got the victory in Christ. We got to embrace the fact that we've been villains to ourselves in our own communities. And we got to do better. We got to do better. This book, it opened my eyes to that, because it made me realize that empire with a white face, I'm able to deal with easily. It's when Empire Strikes Black, that's a play on Empire Strikes Back, Star Wars. When Empire Strikes Black, it becomes difficult. Because now I have to look at myself, and I have to look at, how do I fit into what's happening to me and my people? Because with every layer of oppression, that is a layer where the oppressed has participated voluntarily. All oppression is just not by force. It requires some level of voluntary participation with the oppressed. And that's something that we don't like to talk about. How do we contribute to our own demise? And as black people, this book kind of puts us in that, it puts you in that mindset, because even when thinking about when Paul went to Galatians, and when he went to Jerusalem, and he was when he was addressing the Galatian issue of circumcision, uncircumcision, he encountered a level of hypocrisy from the apostles as a result of them deciding, hey, they didn't want to eat with the Gentiles. They didn't want to basically kick it with the Gentiles when the Jewish sect came on the scene. They basically retreated back to our old way of thinking. And we have to understand that that kind of is what we do when we've made progress as Black Americans, African Americans. And sometimes we retreat back to our old way of thinking when we get a little money. We start to separate ourselves from people who ain't got what we got, not understanding that we have a responsibility to help them get what we got. But, some of the most selfish people I ever met are Black people. Like some of the most giving people I've ever met are Black people. It doesn't excuse it. We can't afford to be selfish. We can't afford to retreat like Peter did and going back to his old way. We can't afford to do that. It's too much riding on it. We have to understand that Black people, we need each other. And Bretson talks about how white Americans are basically built with this individualistic spirit. And they don't understand that at some point you're going to have to unite with a group of people to do something. But that's nothing that they promote in their communities. This is how we're built. We're tribal people. We're all about community. It's how we got to get down. And we have to understand that we can only do that if we learn to look out for each other. Imagine being grouped with a bunch of selfish individuals. You never get anything done. I think that I'm gonna talk to you about some of the stuff that my teammate wrote right now. Let's see. Janet, her commentary stated that it says Rhodes Scholar and preacher par excellence, the Reverend Dr. Brad R. Braxton, is the visionary pastor of Open Door Church located in Artemis, Maryland, and the author of No Longer Slaves. Utilizing Paul's Galatian epistle, he reiterates its profound and sober message that they are made free in Christ. Consequently, the Galatians are no longer slaves to the Roman oppressors, no more than we, as African Americans, are slaves to the oppressive ideologies of white America. Primary purpose of this entire book is influenced by the service of Black and womanist theology. That's the first part of what she wrote. The Galatians not being oppressed by the Roman Empire anymore. Paul had to remind them that they were free. And I think that's a very interesting point, because a lot of times when we deal with white America, when we look at the climate of police brutality, of racism, of sexism, even in modern day America, sometimes we have to be reminded that we're free, even though it don't look like it, it don't feel like it. Braxton's whole book is trying to help us with that mindset that even in this climate, we have to focus and give ourselves the tools to help us focus. Tools such as our African American hermeneutical lens to see things through, to read the Bible through, to interpret society through. That is the tool we have to have in order to see and remind ourselves of our freedom, even when it does not look like it in society. It's important that these tools be accessible to us right now, and we continue to pass it on to new generations. But there's a problem with that concept as well. Millennials and generation, what they call it, X's and Z's and whatever, they don't feel things the way we do. And it's a blessing and a curse, because I believe as my son felt the pain that I felt through being discriminated against and in dealing with racism and issues like that, and even my mom being a part of baby boomers, I think my children would be different children. They wouldn't have the level of compassion and the level of tolerance that they have for people if they had to experience that stuff coupled with the access they have to stuff right now. See, it's the access to stuff that's giving our children this tolerance and the lens that they have to view the church through, to view the Bible through, to view society through. See, what Braxton is trying to promote, there's the African American hermeneutical lens, but there's also the lens that young people have. And a lot of it just is not African American hermeneutical lens. It is a millennial hermeneutical lens. And that lens is very inclusive and very colorblind on some areas. And it makes them vulnerable to things that they should be looking out for. But they like, oh, mom, he's cool. Dad, he's cool. But not understanding, he may be cool, but he come from a foundation. He come from a lineage of people that ain't so cool. See, we understand the generational blessings and curses that often play out in our younger people. They just don't know it. So we have a responsibility to teach them about an African American hermeneutical lens, to look at the Bible through, look at the church through, look at white people through. Okay, now let's see. And she also says, from the first African presence in America to this very moment, African Americans have traveled the long, stony road toward freedom, breaking from the slaves of constitutionality sanctioned to breaking from the slaves of constitutionally sanctioned slavery. Oh, okay, breaking from the bonds of constitutionally sanctioned slavery. Jane and Jim Crow segregation laws and a myriad of discriminatory and racist practices. We have overcome to experience lives of our ancestors who, like the saints of old, died in the faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them and embraced them, had only hoped for. Thus, it would be erroneous to suggest that we have not made remarkable strides as a race. However, because of the obvious advances we have made, many 21st century African Americans, and especially millennials, either believe that, hey, number one, racism no longer as prevalent as it was historically. I just touched on that. Therefore, our fight need to be as tenacious as it has been in the past, or as millennials believe. Number two, racism is no longer a reality. Thus, the rhetoric of social justice is no longer relevant. However, Braxton declares that such is not the case, charging us as Paul did, the Hebrew church. He encourages us to run with perseverance the race that is set before us, Hebrews 12:2. The race, he states, is continued fight against racism, discrimination, and hatred, and equality, justice for African Americans. Braxton is charging us to pick up the baton. He actually says that in the book. But in picking up the baton, we have to really understand the landscape of this race that we're trying to run. It's not a race that is about acquiring wealth or acquiring status. It's a race in basically promoting our relevance, letting people know we are here and we're relevant, we're human beings. We have to promote our humanity. And to be honest with you, it's one of the most difficult things we've ever had to do, because it's nothing like being a human and people not look at you as a human. But we have to understand, in this country, that has been the basis of our very existence, to be a human being and not looked upon as a human being. We are still trying to sell and promote our relevance and our humanity and our right to be here. And that has to consistently, continuously be our race. We have to stop thinking that degrees and dollar signs and zeros and acquiring this different stuff is really what matters to Black America. It's not. That stuff, it comes and goes. Braxton even talks about the fact that, in America, we were not ever considered as humans. They always wanted to strip us of our African lineage, but also refused to give us the opportunity to become Americans. So they wanted us to be a thing that had no place of existence. And that still is the case. And then he says, and once we acquired money, which is green, that's still only second best. Meaning that, okay, we'll accept you on some levels as long as you have money. We have to stop as Black people thinking that that's enough. Either you accept us as a human being or don't accept us at all. But the problem is, we have to accept ourselves as a human being. And we struggle with that. Braxton talks about that in the book. Okay. My teammate brought up these two questions that Braxton talks about in the book. And the first question is, why liberation is self-evidentiary? Braxton states that liberation is evident because if one belongs to a non-dominant group, that is, and has historically suffered from the effects of bondage, the proof for the importance of liberation is essential one. While essential, diseases exhibit concrete symptoms. The mistake people often make when fighting for liberty and or emancipation is that they frequently treat the symptoms without seeking cures for the disease. Cornel West discussed the origins of contemporary Black dilemma. West has called for a direct attack on the sense of worthlessness and self-loathing in Black America. That kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about we have to take some level of responsibility for our place in society right now. Braxton does not hold back on that. He even has a quote in the book from Jeremiah Wright. I can see if I can find that because that was very telling for me. Let me see. Type this in, Jeremiah. Okay, it's actually one of the footnotes in the book, and it's footnote number 6. And it says, Jeremiah Wright forthrightly addresses the lies white culture has perpetuated about Black culture. Wright remarks, most African Americans have heard the lie that Black people don't really have a culture. Most of us have been told that if it had not been for Europeans capturing some of us, bringing us to America, teaching us a few things, colonizing our extended families in Africa, and teaching them a few things to this day, we would still have no culture. Of course, not all Africans and African Americans have accepted these lies as truth. Some African American scholars have uncovered evidence that, contrary to popular beliefs, the opposite of traditional lies is true. They discovered that if it had not been for Africans, perhaps Europeans would not have had any culture at all, for they got most of the original civilized information from us, not the other way around. We have built this society, and we have to take responsibility for where we are in it. We understand that we have been done wrong, and a lot of things have been done to us, but we still have to embrace the fact that we are the reason they even exist here. They don't exist without our labor, without our passion, without our vision, without our strength. And we have to live like that. We have to think like that. We have some level of responsibility here. We supposed to be here. But as we move forward, we have to move forward with Braxton's, his African-American hermeneutical lens to see how to be the best people we can be right now and what we need for the future generations to come. Now, the next question was, what does liberation mean? Braxton states, my hesitation at suggesting too specifically what liberation might mean stems from the fear of committing what African Americans might call the heresy of exactness. True. Additionally, Braxton argues the social factor that arguably has most defined and shaped the existence of African Americans is Blackness. This is not the biology of Blackness because this is predetermined. When Braxton speaks of Blackness, he suggests it is the constant and difficult choice to be consciously Black and to accept as part of one's identity the history, joys, and struggles of Black people. That's on page 6. It is possible for one to be Black biologically, but not Black in the ideological sense. Also, it is possible for one who is white biologically to sympathize with African American struggle, but only up to a point. For the possibility always remains for white persons to stop being Black at any moment, and at any moment that the struggles of being Black no longer fit the person's agenda. To me, that is one of the most important points in the whole book. Because we as African Americans being black is difficult. We know that. I mean, it's difficult, but it's difficult because of all the responsibility that comes with it, as well as the responsibility to survive. It's dangerous being black. You can't just be black and go to work, be black and take care of your family, be black and enjoy a good barbecue on Saturday. You have to be consciously black of everything going on around you so you can survive. And that is a difficult burden. I remember I was working in Richmond, Virginia, when a lot of the police brutality and a lot of black men were being killed by cops at traffic and stuff like that. And I was talking to these white guys. I was the only black guy on the job at the time. And we had to go from the job site to the hotel. And I was like, man, number one, I don't like driving them out of town anyway. I just don't trust white society like that. I got issues. But I remember leaving work and going back to the hotel where we all was staying. And we was all out on the patio smoking cigars. Here I am with these 4 white guys and the only black guy. And, this was their opportunity to ask questions about the black experience. And you know me, I'm up for the questions, but I didn't think they were going to really be up for the answers. But I didn't hold back. And I explained to them how difficult it is for me to drive while I'm out of town. And they had no idea what I was talking about. And I was like, man, every time I get behind the steering wheel, I get nervous. And they were like, wow. I was like, man, driving a car for a black man is a hazardous job. And they got quiet. I was like, you guys have no idea what it's like to have an anxiety attack when you see a police car behind you and he's probably just changing lanes. And they were like, why does that happen to you? I was like, man, because if I get pulled over, there's a potential I may be killed. And all their faces turned red. Some because they disagreed and some because they had no idea what I was talking about. But in that moment, only one chose to get in that black experience with me. He was a Jewish guy. And he wanted to hear what that felt like. And he was like, man, I never knew what that was like, Juwan. So there's some out there that's willing to get in this black experience with us, and there's some who really don't give a damn. But Braxton lets us know that, there's some that sympathize with us, and some that only sympathize because they have an agenda. A lot of times it's politics. A lot of times it's, personal gain. And we are always leery, as he talks about this in the book too, as black people, we are always leery of white sympathizers. We are, because to be honest with you, it's easier to deal with a white hater than it is to deal with a white sympathizer. Because we're constantly trying to feel them out for their authentic purpose in being on our side. We as black people, we have trust issues, and we have a right to have them. We have a right to have those issues. Let's see what else. My teammate, she wrote a lot, and I really think I might be over my time now. This thing is supposed to be 40 minutes. Let me give you a little bit more of this right here, though. My teammate said the African American interpretive community. Braxton most interested in the uneducated black population. I found that to be very interesting in the book as well. I'm glad my teammate wrote about it. Braxton talks about there's a certain population that he was very interested in when he basically was talking to people. Here this man is, he's a professor at a college. He has a advanced degree. And he says some of the most important people in his life that have given him wisdom and these golden nuggets have been people, very uneducated people. He talks about the cafeteria workers, construction guys, and all these people that at the school that he worked at that he would just sit and talk to. And it gave them such validation that someone of his caliber would talk to them but they had no idea the level of gratitude that he had with the opportunity to talk to them and them pouring into his life and giving him the nuggets to continue to excel and stand on their shoulders, because he understood that he had a responsibility to people who didn't have the opportunities that he had as far as education was concerned. We as black people, like I said earlier, that we have a tendency to write off those who don't have what we have. And that is Achilles' heel in our community. We won't get far being that way. Braxton talks about that in the book. He says that class differences not the most important in the black community. Other things bind us together. And the last part of what I want to talk about was the Nicodemus story. Braxton talks about that in the book. How Nicodemus comes to Jesus in the middle of the night, and he wants to get understanding from Christ about this whole born again thing. And he talks to Jesus, and Jesus explains to him, it's not about what you know, Nicodemus. It's about having an experience. And that's the one thing as black people, we've had an experience with God that a lot of the races can't claim. He talks about, to engage a black hermeneutic, whites must be born again and must become black. The whole Nicodemus story is a preface to that, because it gives us the understanding as to what's required to truly engage the black community. That you can't talk to us from across the table and get what you need. You have to come to our side of the table and sit in it with us. That's the only way you're going to embrace and understand this African-American hermeneutical lens, as well as this African-American experience. And to be honest with you, we can't just give it to them. They have to want it. They have to want it. And that's why I think we are now in the whole process of it all. We're at a point as African-Americans to where we realize, hey, we may be standing in this thing all by ourselves. And as a result, we all we got. But in essence, we all we need. But for the sake of peace, we have to be willing to keep the door open for those that want to come through and experience this African-American hermeneutical lens, experience this African-American experience, to let them know it's available to you if you want it. All right, fam. I could go all day with this thing, but I think I was only supposed to go 40 minutes. I'm at 48. I just want to thank you, Dr. Toure, for an amazing class. You know, this class was all that. And to have that experience going to Prophet Conference, to learn about things that I had no idea about. I just really appreciate who you are as a professor, as a woman, as a leader. You are the professor in my community organizing class too, and that's been an amazing journey as well. Thank you so much. Much love, fam. Thank you. Bye-bye.